Thank you and good morning. Great to see everyone here. We'll get right into it. So the scene-setting material in the programs describes the situation we're facing. We'll start with the first half of this material, the nonfiction part. Essentially, the situation is as it is today, with the finance sector facing a series of serious distributed denial of service attacks, which government officials and others have blamed on a proxy group linked to Iran. Brian, we'll start with you, representing the finance sector. What's happening within the finance sector right now?
Well, these are very serious attacks in the sense that they raise a lot of important concerns. They can, for at least a time, prevent customers of banks from accessing their accounts online and conducting transactions. If that persists, customers not only complain, it gets into the press, and you create reputational risk for those institutions. For that reason, the banks have, since the beginning of these attacks, worked together, sharing information, what they knew about the attacks, what they were doing to prevent them, and responding to them in the hopes of mitigating and preventing further attacks. They've also been working with the government, the Treasury Department, and other federal agencies to get as much intelligence as they can about where these attacks are emanating from and what may be coming next. I mean, thus far, they have been rather annoyances as opposed to serious operational concerns. They've communicated with customers to address any reputational concerns, so that has not been a problem, but it could escalate. And they need to know if and when that might happen because they want to take the proper measures, but also it's expensive for this to continue as it is. So it's important that this cease at some point.
Okay, so next I'd like to keep the focus on the private sector for a bit. So we'll go to Bill Woodcock and then to Dmitry Alperovich in that order. So Bill, so you've done a lot of work in many different areas in private sector. What's happening on your side? If you can describe the kind of role that you might play.
I think the important thing to remember about the internet is that it's built and operated by the private sector. And so when there are problems like this, it's the private sector that is in a position to actually solve them. In order to do that, we have to have information. And so looking at this most recent round of attacks against the banks, by and large, the private sector outside of the banking industry didn't have enough information to solve that problem, right? Mm-hmm. The banking customers, although they were in contact with government, were not in contact with their own internet service providers enough for those service providers to be able to shut down the attacks. So if you go back and look at the Russian attack against Estonia, that was the single most
in 2007.
In 2007, the single most important and effective component of that attack was against the banking sector, which caused Estonians, particularly Estonians abroad, to be unable to access their bank accounts during the first night of that attack, since it was in the middle of the night Estonia time, but for Estonian expats, it was a problem.
And this is something that I think we'll come to quite a bit, is what is the role, how can ISPs help on this? How can other non-state groups be there to help balance out? Because when we've looked back at cyber conflicts as they've happened, the private sector is frequently in this role of being the ones to get out the information and to actually mitigate the attack, sometimes on the request of governments, but not always. Is that right?
Usually it's on the request of whoever is paying for the service. So
right.
In this case, the banks have the commercial contractual relationship with the internet service providers. And an internet service provider is not going to pull the plug on any traffic that they're being paid for unless it's at the request of the person paying for it. So in this case, it's the bank that has to hand the attack signature, the fingerprint of the attack, to their internet service provider in order to get the attack stopped.
Great. Okay, thank you. Dmitry, you've had a long career in the cybersecurity industry. So in general, the banks are seeing these distributed denial of service attacks. How does the cybersecurity industry fit in?
Well, Jay, the cybersecurity industry is galvanized to respond to this problem. We're working closely with the banks, who are our customers after all, to collect logs, to analyze traffic types that they're seeing. And one of the primary goals of our initiative is to figure out where the attacks are coming from and how we can actually mitigate that threat. So one of the things we've discovered is that this type of botnet is actually very unique. from typical botnets. It's not involving end-user machines that are compromised, as is very typical with normal denial of service scenarios, but the attackers in this case have actually went after application servers, web servers, typically hosting blog sites. And the reason they've done this is because these types of servers typically have a lot of bandwidth coming into them. And as a result, the attacks are very large. They're in excess of 100 gigabits per second in terms of packets that are being sent to some of these banking websites.
So how big is that? So
That's
hundreds of gigabits, I mean.
That's about 10 to 20 times larger than typical botnets that we normally see. So it is very significant. And one of the things we've realized is that there are thousands of servers that are involved that are being compromised. And as a security industry, we are collaborating with law enforcement, we're collaborating with each other to share information on what we're discovering on these servers. So we're reaching out voluntarily to victims that we identify, whose machines have been compromised and are part of this botnet, and trying to get information from them on what malicious software is on their machines, and then providing them free remediation services in order to minimize the impact of the botnet.
Okay. And how well do you think will these steps that some that Bob talked about and you talk about, will that ease it? Will that stop it?
Well, we're very frustrated, Jay, because we've actually been doing this for about 6 months now, and it's really been a whack-a-mole strategy, because for every machine we take down, 10 others appear in its place, and a lot of the machines are actually reinfected. So a lot of these companies that are hosting these sites are small businesses. They don't really have security practices, security officials, so even if you give them best practices for how to secure their website, they may not implement it correctly or may not keep their systems up to date, and they get reinfected. And a lot of times we're not even able to reach the victims because they may be in other countries and in places where they're not necessarily responding to our requests. So it's a great challenge that we're facing.
Dimitri, give me a sense of talking about botnets. And for the crowds in the audience's perspective and mine, what are we talking about here? We're talking about computers that are being taken over by a malicious actor around the world, around the globe, in certain areas geographically, or are we talking about computers being used in Germany and the United States, everywhere?
It's really a global problem, Tom, and one of the things we see is that there are computers in over 80 countries that are involved in these attacks. Now, the reality is that most of the bandwidth is coming from industrialized countries where they have high bandwidth connections, but nevertheless, you do see quite a spread of these computers around the world. But you're absolutely right. These are compromised machines, essentially innocent third parties that have been taken over and are now being used for this activity.
Great, thank you. And I think it'll be interesting as we talk to the government people, those representing government, like Tom and Greg, and what's the government's role in trying to clamp down on those botnets. But first, I'd like to turn to Siobhan. You're here, you're representing the media. I mean, this kind of thing is going to be getting quite a bit of headlines, and how do you position yourself in that?
Well, oftentimes in a situation like this, we will first know about it because you see the external effects. And one of the things that's interesting about covering cyber threats compared to other types of threats like counterterrorism or some of the other kinds of things that happen more quietly in the intelligence world, there's often some sort of external element to it that is more difficult for people to ignore, companies that may not want to make it public or government agencies that may not want to make it public. So in situations like this, we would probably see an impact on bank websites and things like that. So you're looking at it both from how is this impacting the customer, but then also trying to go back and figure out who did it. And so in the early phases of coverage of a story like this, you're just tapping any sources you have, whether it's in industry or whether it's in government, et cetera, just trying to piece together things as much as possible, and then bouncing that back against official government sources to the degree that they're willing to play ball at that point, which at the early phases is usually pretty minimal because they're also trying to figure out what's going on.
So is it easier so in this case, there are some government officials, members of Congress, that are saying, this is Iran, this is intolerable. Does that make your job more or less difficult? If it's a national security problem, does the government clam up in ways that they wouldn't if this were just a criminal matter?
Well, particularly with Iran, you can't look at these kinds of situations in a vacuum at all. And part of the reason why I think we see a slower, more deliberate response is that we're looking at a government that is trying to figure out, well, how significant is this in the grand scheme of things? I mean, in terms of trying to manage situations both with Iran and negotiations over the nuclear program, as well as managing our relationships with other countries. And at the same time, the government has been very carefully trying to manage this relationship with the private sector. So, in the U.S. in particular, there's been a real reluctance for the government to appear to be directing the private sector to do something. And so, in terms of their public message, they're going to be very, very careful about what they say, because they're worried about it having unintended consequences reverberating either in terms of the foreign relations arena or the global economy.
And let's turn to Tom and then Greg to be hearing. So, I mean, there's two aspects of this that I think are important for the government side. Well, at least two. So, one, this could be a country which we are in already quite a bit of kerfuffle with, a national security crisis. How does this fit in? Is this a new cyber problem? And also, if it is in fact a country that's affecting our private sector, does that mean things that happen differently, either for the Homeland Security side or defense and intelligence? And again,
Right.
we'll go Tom and then Greg, and then we'll close with Paul.
Right, now there's a number of big questions there. So there's two, but they're really themes. And under those themes, we've got a number of issues. I think Saban touched on one. There's a number of audiences. We've got audiences that are the enemy. We've got audiences that are the friends. We've got allies in foreign countries, and we've got congressional members and a number of people with responsibilities for American citizens and their safety, and including the American citizenry. And that's an audience that we have to be careful of as well. So her challenge is to report things faithfully, and I think sometimes the government's challenge is to carefully address each audience without giving one statement that could be misconstrued to one audience's point of view. So cyber is an interesting issue when you couple it with, and I would argue that you almost always couple it with some other ongoing nation-state tension. And in this case, we've chosen the Iranian tension, which is quite hot and quite tense. So yes, it changes things, but I think the White House right now is in discovery mode. We're trying to learn information, trying to gain insight, we're trying to, and actually it's maybe a misnomer to think that the White House is running this operation of collecting information. There's plenty of people calling us. So we have private sector represented here. At this stage, I'd imagine there are CEOs of big and small companies calling banks and otherwise saying, we demand to talk to you, we demand some type of satisfaction, we at least want to be heard, and we'll talk to your agencies, but we want decision makers and we want to have access to power. So in some ways, White House staff have an easy job here. We get the luxury of asking a lot of questions. Eventually, they have the hard job of making tough recommendations. So I think the thing to remember here is that we are now trying to put into context these cyber attacks against our greater strategic objectives. We're looking at Iran seemingly attempting to gain nuclear capability, and we don't want that. And the UN has spoken repeatedly, and the Security Council in Germany has met to say this is unacceptable. But now we've got cyber attacks. And I think it might be a mistake for us to consider denial of service attacks, which the financial industry admits is kind of a mass disruption as opposed to a mass destruction, as something that would tip us into war. And so we want to, I think, at this point have a steady hand on the till and not necessarily rush into some counterattack. But the pressures will be mounting.
But there's other things that we might be able to do to directly help the private sector in this. I mean, if the banks are being attacked and it is an adversary of the United States, then there might be things that we can do.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a number of thoughts here. Attribution tends to be a focus of concern for people because they want to look at holding someone accountable. Now, there's another reason for attribution. If it's a nation state, the federal government has a different responsibility. It's fundamental. It's constitutional to the protection of the country. If it's a private actor, we have a slightly different responsibility, and we tend to treat these things as law enforcement matters and so forth. So attribution has an effect on our government's responsibility, I think. But cyber is a distributed problem. And it was interesting to hear Bill's first words to say it's really a private industry problem and that they're really interested in protecting themselves. And something I want to explore a little bit later, but there's a number of things that we can do short of going to war to stop the Iranians. There's a number of things that we can do, but I will say that we're doing a lot of them already to impose negative conditions to change the behavior of the Iranian regime with respect to nuclear development. So adding some additional constraint is unlikely to deter irrational actors, if you will. So there's a number of things we can do defensively, but offensively, the government is in the prickliest of situations.
Sure.
And defensively, we're in the most, or perhaps the least powerful of positions, with private industry taking a grand lead.
Great. Greg, from the defense and intelligence side, what can you add?
Well, starting from the defense side, the situation has been going on for a series of months. The Defense Department is planning and providing options as different things happen. As Tom strongly stated, this is in the context of a broader issue. It may become a more serious aspect, but right now the primary concern is Iran's nuclear ambitions, and we're planning a full range of things to deal with the next step and how that may progress. So things in terms of if a provocation, we need to react quickly, deliberative things that the president has declared that he's not going to allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. The cyber aspect has become more important in all of our planning. This particular situation has now developed that dimension, so we're looking at options for the president and the government if they decide to take more aggressive action to potentially suppress these activities. We're helping analyze the source of the attack, both the capabilities of the actors and who's behind that, both from a defense perspective, which has a lot of intelligence capabilities, and the broader intelligence community, and that is done increasingly with the private sector. There's a lot of discussions about information sharing. There's legislation on the Hill, but some of that has certainly already begun, and the Defense Department participates largely through DHS and the FBI in some of those sharing discussions. We're certainly in the intelligence community as well are trying to share both directions. I think the points made by Bill, some of the best information is in the hands of the private sector as regards where these attacks are coming. We've seen a blossoming in cyber threat intelligence actually coming out of the private sector. So we're trying to leverage that as well as add to it. We have to be concerned about our ability to operate. So I would, in this situation at this time with the denial of service attacks, I would propose that we're not seriously concerned about that, but we've been surprised a lot in the past 5 years. I mean, if you went back 18 months, there was not a lot of concern about DDoS attacks, and technically most people that do cybersecurity thought that these things were under control. They've taken on an aspect over the last 6 to 12 months that has surprised. So, we are worried about strategic surprise, and, we have learned not to be overconfident related to either the integrity or the ability to operate our global system. So we treat this very seriously. We're also working with our partners in the government. I mean, cyber, has been mentioned, is multidimensional. There's a diplomatic aspect, so in terms of what we can do, we got to closely coordinate with the State Department. We have allies that also have capabilities and interests in what we might do in cyberspace. We certainly have partners in the Gulf region who, as we know, the Saudis, Aramco company had a major cyber incident, which was also a surprise technically to us when a lot of computers were wiped, so we need to make sure our allies, who may be places we need to operate on, or may have, if they're attacked, they may draw us into a conflict in a way that we need to. So resiliency for ourselves and for our allies is a primary concern.
I think it's an interesting point about how you felt just distributed denial of service attacks were stopping to be a serious concern and something that was starting to be under control. And I think you see that also with the attack that happened against Saudi Aramco, 18 months ago now, where a lot of the hard drives were rendered pretty much inoperable, which was something that we would think about more for the computer viruses in the 80s or early 90s, early 2000s, when that kind of malicious software was going around, but not recently. So it's interesting to see these trends and how the technology changes. So Paul, we'll finish with you. You've done this internationally. You've advising companies on this. You've done work on this for Australia. What do you think of the responses so far, and how would this be seen by the international community?
Well, the international community is a very broad thing. The closer allies, I think, would share a lot of the same interests, and there'd be a lot of discussions going on in this town and elsewhere sharing information. I think if you would take a broader group of people,
the less close, maybe the friends and others group. I think they would see this as, first of all, there may not be that much attention to it. I think the degree of media attention in the United States on this issue is way beyond what occurs in other parts of the world. I think the degree of business engagement or even political engagement on this issue in large parts of the world are nothing like it is in the United States. And so there's a tendency in this country, I think, a little bit to have a discussion assuming everybody else places such a high priority on this. I'm not certain that is true. I think people would be looking at it a little bit in terms of quid pro quo for Stuxnet. Yes, they did one, tit for tat. I think there'd be a reaction which was at the more technical levels, the people who are in those governments who would be interested in watching this stuff carefully, which is, is there picking up your point, is there a low-tech, an old-tech weapon I can use, an old-tech approach I can use? If the Americans are going to deploy things, supposedly, that are very advanced, can I copy from this playbook a low advanced approach? I think there'd be a lot of attention paid to the spam house. Actually, I think people would pay a lot of attention to the spam house attack more than they would to this one. They'd be looking at that and saying, well, can we take those two approaches, and we should put that in our locker to think about.
Can you say just quickly on spam house? Just put it into context.
Spam house is and Woody could talk about this in more detail too, I suspect, but it's spam house is a case of one private player saying to another private player, you're the host of a lot of nasty stuff, and people associated with the other player saying, that's fine, we're now going to attack you and your infrastructure providers, right up to the internet exchange points, and more importantly, deploying very large-scale DDoS, much bigger than the ones we're talking about the banks. We're talking, many gigabits. So, so I think the international approach to this will be to watch this closely, not to have too much sympathy for the United States, and to pick up whatever points I can if I need to use it, if I've got the United States as an adversary in the future.
Is that, I imagine that's something that if that's something of the international feeling, so on our government side, is it, what cases are you making there?
Yeah, we're going to leave cyber here very quickly behind and start talking about all the interests and counter-interests that we have with our allies and enemies alike. And I think one of the things that I want to pick up on there is to further explore, I think what Greg talked about is military planning. We can't just simply do a military planning exercise that we might have done 50 years ago. There are now questions about the reliability of our plans in respect to allegations that Iran has Russian jamming technologies and other things. So we're now looking at the plans, we're looking at the veracity of those plans, and we're looking at what our counterparts and other parties are going to do in reaction. So I raise Russia just as a point of conversation here because they've got a grand interest in Iran. It's in their backyard, and they're traditionally an oil supplier. They're cooperating with sanctions right now, as we understand. So now, does Russia have an interest in looking at what we do and perhaps exploiting that by exploiting our cyber capabilities? And I guess my question would be to Paul, I guess before I close that thought, is the rest of the world looking at this problem a little differently because the United States is perhaps overreacting to the vulnerability or perceived threat? Or is it looking at it differently because they're not quite as dependent upon the internet as the United States, which has run headlong from an industry perspective into depending onto the internet?
I think the degree of interdependence driven by the combination of networks is becoming increasingly universal. I think it's come with globalization.
Right.
I think the American political process 4 or 5 years ago, there were some of us in this room, this would be a much smaller conversation. Right, but Siobhan and her colleagues have really made in the last several years, have made a big change, and boardrooms have made a big change in the United States. That's where I see the big switch here. I don't see that in lots of other parts of the world per se. The only observation I'd make is inside the United States, America's the good guy. Outside the United States, America's not necessarily the good guy. So there are parts of the world which would be looking at this with a fairly cold view of the United States capability, with an assumption that the most advanced player in this space is actually the United States, and we should watch this carefully.
Well, will that perception hold up in the public's mind when they look at their trustworthy spy agencies and they say we're confident that they're out for our best financial well-being?
Well, there is a certain amount of skepticism in the public as well of too much government and particularly spy agency intervention into this space. And so as the media continues to probe what is happening here, one of the big questions is going to be how much quote unquote technical assistance are intelligence agencies like the National Security Agency providing to the companies now that are being affected by this. And presumably, although others on the panel could speak to this, the companies will be thinking quite a bit in terms of how much assistance they accept, because they may presume that ultimately that information will become public and they will have to manage that image, because from a public perception perspective, a lot of the cybersecurity discussion is still dealing with a little bit of a hangover from the whole warrantless surveillance debate that happened during the Bush administration, where there was a widespread perception that there was a very cozy relationship between the National Security Agency and telecommunications companies. And so that kind of backdrop is what a lot of governments and companies, particularly telecommunications companies, but others as well, are evaluating their actions against.
Great. Okay, we'll go to Greg, and then I think we'll move forward in the scenario.
Just first from the intelligence community perspective and related to information sharing and some of the remarks Siobhan just made, the president did announce in his recent State of Union address, I think it's the executive order, about the ability to do an enhanced cybersecurity program, which is an effort to try to take the knowledge that the government has and give that to ISPs and potentially other companies.
So knowledge from like intelligence
From
community.
intelligence, the intelligence community, but broader sources. It could also be the FBI during criminal investigations, but with the notion to protect sources and methods, which is always the tension here, but to provide insight that the private sector may not get from its own intelligence efforts, and provide that to providers that can help protect particularly critical infrastructures. And that's sort of, to get in the game, you have to be a critical infrastructure player. The effectiveness of this, of course, needs to be determined at an operational level, whether the information we can actually glean and give is actually as helpful as what the private sector can do on its own. I think it's good for both sides to be trying and to empirically test what works.
There are a couple bits there that I'd like to pick up on in the second half, because we talked a lot about
Jay, though,
intelligence and threat.
Yeah, real quick, because I think
ahead.
Paul made an important point about the U.S. being threatening. And from the Defense Department perspective, we've been on the road to stand up Cyber Command, right? And we've got to manage that closely. It is clear with this sort of situation that we need national security, military capabilities in this realm. The purpose of those capabilities and how they work to secure our interests and those of our allies, needs to be properly message, and we do not want to create arms races and things that make it more difficult for this nation by militarizing cyberspace. So I think it's a delicate balance for us as we try to provide the capabilities the nation needs, but not worsen the situation for the nation through international fear and and inability to build norms around the things we want because we're seen as the threatening actor. So I just wanted to make that point about the delicate balance.
That's a great point, and I think we're going to keep hearing this tension as we go through the scenario here. And there's a few other bits that I think we're going to come across. What are the specific actions that the private sector can do versus the specific actions the government can do? You brought up, Greg, this information sharing and with the finance sector intelligence, and I think there's probably a lot of people that didn't know that the finance sector spends a lot of money on intelligence to try and figure out threats and what's going to happen next. And in fact, quite a bit of the cybersecurity industry itself is built around trying to figure out what's actually happening. So I think as we go into this next, that'll all be interesting things to hear about, not just airily talking about public-private sector partnerships, but saying specifically, what kinds of things we can get into to mitigate these kinds of attacks. But let's jump forward. So we'll now go back to the scene-setting material that you have. We fast forward to July 2013, the second half of the scene setter in everyone's programs, and it begins the fiction section. The Iranian elections held last month have once again gone poorly, with popular unrest and harsh crackdowns. The newly elected hardline government is strongly connected to the supreme leader and soon announces enough of imperialist and Zionist economic warfare. Fire should always be met with fire. As noting in the scene setter, many sectors across the United States are attacked by an intensifying of wide-ranging online proxy attacks that go by the name Operation Azarakh. So, Paul, these cyber attacks are similar to normal patriotic hacking that we've been seeing for 15 years, but soon develop into one of the worst ever collections of incidents. So how do you see the international community would view something like this, still largely affecting the United States? Does it change your answer now that it's broadly intensified and it's affecting many more obviously civilian targets, although it is affecting the government and Department of Defense as well?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of parts to that. One is, I'll make an observation, I think, about the technical community. You talk about the international community. A core part of this discussion is that unlike in other parts of international cooperation, where often you talk about private sector and you talk about government, maybe civil society, in this part of international endeavour, there's a very important community, which is the technical community, which is both entities like ICANN, regional internet registries, and players like that who play a role in the coordination of the infrastructure, or the protocols of the infrastructure. But I think also the network operators, who, although they're employees of companies, often work in their own culture. I think all of those people would be alarmed because they see their main role as ensuring that we have a single interoperable internet and it keeps working. So their response is not going to be a punishment response. Right? Their response is going to be, how do we ensure and help people to keep this open, because that's the core thing we need to have. I think that at a series of, if you move up to governmental levels, I think there would also be alarm. And I think they'd be, again, watching this very carefully. I think the dynamic might change in that environment. I think then you might find that there'll be more there's a spectrum between the Five Eyes through to someone out here.
Yeah,
I think part of the spectrum, the close allies, part of this spectrum would become more friendly towards, or more interested to know what the United States response is, and would want to learn a lot more, and would be concerned and be asking its own authorities to look at collateral effects of this work, particularly as it might affect trading and financial transactions.
I think there's a problem that the US government and the Brazilian government share, which is that they have a relatively naive notion of who our allies are, and it's relatively unconnected to information coming from the private sector. So, for instance, the notion that Saudi Arabia is one of our allies rather than one of the three key players in the opposition is a problematic one when we're dealing with one of their nearest, largest neighbors, right? So from the private sector point of view, the two things that I want to know are what is Iran's relationship with the ex-SSRs between the Black Sea and Frankfurt like, and what is their relationship with Saudi Arabia like? Because those are the two groups that have influence over their capabilities. Those are the people connecting them to the rest of the world.
And so will that communication be happening amongst the largest network providers or amongst?
Yeah, I mean, we all coordinate and we have our counterparts on the other side of the line, but just as in the political sector, there's only so far you can trust what you hear from the people on the other side of the line, and you have to interpret it, and you have to check it against facts on the ground. I think that this is actually one of the largest things that blocks information sharing with the public sector, is the fact that the public sector is so leaky to people on the other side.
And so how does the exchange happen? So if we're seeing these massive, these large-scale attacks, some of them distributed denial of service, others in intrusions and defacements and more nuisancy, but still quite a bit. So what happens in that communication, and Paul or Greg, you can jump in here, between the largest network operators to try and mitigate this?
So there's kind of a filtering down from the sort of the most private coordination mechanisms, where the first coordination happens, then down through several tiers of broadening the information sharing, so that other internet service providers who may have some small part in being able to shut down a problem can do their part. The very first largest core network providers are a very small group, but then you quickly widen out to a group of about 3,000 companies. And at that point, the press has visibility into it as well. And so typically, after a few hours, people start getting calls from the press. Then, an hour or so after that, it becomes public knowledge, and then the government starts calling and asking questions as well.
And I think I'll go to Dimitri next and stay in the private sector, but I do want to ask, so what you're saying, so a Verizon or an AT&T, these major, we'll call them tier 1 providers, they would be talking to Deutsche Telekom or British Telecom or NTT Docomo and saying, we're seeing this attack traffic, can you please help make this stop?
Exactly. I mean, there are formal mechanisms for this that mean that the coordination goes to the specific people who are able to take action to stop it. It's not just kind of a generalized plea for help.
Right.
But yes.
And does government, do you route those through the Department of Homeland Security first, or?
No, government has no action that they can take at that point, right? The role of government is to play a part in deterrence and, law enforcement after the fact, right? I mean, it's before and after, not during, that government has a role.
Right. Okay. We'll go to the government. We'll go to the government in a second. But I'm sure the cybersecurity companies are going to be. You're going to be having some busy weeks. How do you play? I mean, it's the largest ever kind of patriotic hacking conflict that we've seen. How are you all working?
Yeah, well, Jay, it's been a long few months. We've been really drinking lots of coffee, working this problem. One of the things we're very engaged in is collecting intelligence. So we're not just relying on the government. We have meetings with the government trying to assess what they have. A lot of these meetings, quite frankly, have not been very productive. So to the extent that we're getting any information out of the government, it has all been in the classified settings and has not been actionable because you can't necessarily take that information and use it in the outside world.
And I'm curious, so you want intelligence, but what decisions is that intelligence going to drive? I mean, so you get the intelligence to do what better or differently?
Well, we're trying to understand the capabilities of the threat actors that are involved, who they are, why they're going after the targets that they've gone after, so that we can be more predictive in understanding and protecting our broader customer base that has not yet been impacted by the attacks, and figure out where's the adversary going to go next. So one of the things we're doing is trying to infiltrate some of those groups, trying to get access to their infrastructure through voluntary measures or even legal process to the extent that we can, civil legal process, and figure out what exploits are they using, what are their malware capabilities, what botnets are they creating or purchasing from others, what discussions are they having in their sort of underground forums about what other activities they may be involved in. And a lot of that information is being disseminated to our customers so that they can be more predictive in trying to protect themselves and understand before the problem arrives on their doorstep what they may face.
Wow. So the cybersecurity industry is trying to infiltrate some of these networks. It's interesting. That's something that we think of for the Bureau doing.
Well, actually, the Bureau has come to us and asked us for the information that we have on this problem.
Right. Oh, wow. So some of the companies are saying enough is enough. We want to do something about this. What's our answer?
Well, a lot of our customers are quite angry, particularly the banks, because they've been facing this now for close to a year, and the problem has not abated. So one of the differences here is not just in the scale of the attacks, but their longevity. So oftentimes when we see DDoS attacks being perpetrated by hacktivist groups or by criminal organizations like the Spamhaus attacks, they may spike up but die down very quickly because the adversaries will frankly lose interest and move on to other things that they view as more important, such as making money. But in this case, it has not stopped. And in fact, the adversary has continued to evolve. So as we're putting out countermeasures to particular things that they've been doing, they've continued to evolve. They're looking at our countermeasures and figuring out how to put measures in place to defeat them. And it's been an ongoing cat and mouse game that really is striking in its longevity. And one of the things that we are hearing from our customers is, what can you do to actually stop this activity? Because we're spending lots and lots of money on DDoS mitigation services, and DDoS mitigation really means bigger pipes. So you're spending lots and lots of money paying ISPs and others to provide you with bigger bandwidth capacity so that when the overwhelming storm of packets is heading your way, you actually have the pipe to sustain it. It really is not rocket science, but it costs a lot of money to do. Our other customers, as well as the banks, are also allocating a lot of human resources to this problem. The attacks have been pretty ingenious in that they're not just sending lots and lots of rogue traffic down your way, but they're also finding ways to impact weaknesses in your infrastructure. So you may have a login page on a particular banking website that when you send a request to that page, it generates a lot of database connections on the back end, for example, which really stresses your system. And when you have a lot of these connections being initiated, you really start to take down your back-end infrastructure, not just the front-end web servers. So it's having significant impact, and the banks are really saying, and other customers, what can you do more aggressively? However, we have had meetings with the government, we have meetings with the White House, with the FBI, and they have told us, stand down, do not do anything. In fact, if you do anything that we will view as a violation of Computer Fraud Abuse Act or the Electronic Communications and Privacy Act, we may prosecute you yourself, so we'll go after you as victims.
And so aggressive might be if you know that there are these 100,000 computers that are involved in this attack, and those 100,000 are controlled by these 10, maybe if we can just disrupt the operation of these 10, and so the government is saying in this case, no, you can't go do that. Let's go next. I think Brian caught my attention first, and then Tom's trying to catch my attention, and then I'll go to my left side.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And from the banking point of view, it's got it down pat. This isn't just a private problem, it's a blended private-public problem. And it requires a blended response, which is what we're trying to forge. Government has a role. It's questionable whether that role is right now in the current state of events, or depending on the consequences of our July 2013 events, an attack mode, an offensive response, simply because, as we saw from Spam House, you can have that attack come back to you. I mean, banks were hit in response to that attack, and they weren't the ones responsible for it. So you almost have that kidnapping effect. Don't bring in the FBI, or we'll do something to the kidnapped victim. And we have to take that into account. Where government has a role in the environment before there's a response needed of that nature is in bringing the relevant private sector components together with the relevant public sector components. So we bring in the ISPs, bring in the cybersecurity experts, and try to push towards a better solution to the problem as it exists, as opposed to automatically going to an attack response.
Okay. Tom? And then I'll go to
a couple of
Paul, and then Greg.
disjointed thoughts I wanted to raise. I think the government, this is an interesting maybe perspective behind the curtain, is going to be very aware, at least in the intelligence circles, of the spheres of influence that Bill mentioned and of the centers of informational power. Now, what they do with it and their motivations are different from those being attacked in private industry. But I think, among other things, just a kind of a bureaucratic matter. I and people that are in the White House now, I'm certain, are convening meetings on a regular basis at high levels to discuss this. And they say to the intelligence community, what are you seeing? What are you observing? For instance, for the Saudi Arabians actively engaging in this conduct or permitting it openly and obviously. And if that's true, let's have a outside the public eye, without hopefully Shaban in the room to report on this. Let's have a meeting between the counterparts. So I want the head of my CIA to go talk to his counterpart in Saudi Arabia and make clear that we don't find that conduct acceptable. And there's a number of things that person, if it's the CIA director, must take with him in terms of incentives or sticks or carrots or punishments. And so I think what we're seeing is that happening, but it's not happening in the public eye. And I think it might be both a positive thing for private industry to know, but also contributing to this notion that the United States is being quite onerous in its kind of bull in a china shop conduct with respect to cyber. Yeah. And then just briefly, and I want to come back to this.
But I do like that, because it gets to what can the government actually do? You know what I mean? Most of the levers are either with the companies being attacked, they're asking, for example, more bandwidth, or the cybersecurity companies that are providing them with additional security tools, or the tier one network providers.
What government can do is assist with the deterrence and assist with law enforcement, right? It's keep it from happening in the first place by helping the world understand why it's not going to work, and then after it happens, help clean up. Go
Yeah, I think
after
there's a number of powers,
international law.
though, in addition to that, right? There's soft powers, but there's also economic powers and trade sanctions, and there's money to be thrown around, and I think that happens.
There are a number of things we as an industry have asked of the government that we have not gotten to our satisfaction. One is details on the intelligence they have. They have a lot of capabilities from SIGINT perspective, human, et cetera, on who these actors are, why they're doing these activities, and what capabilities they have. And that information has not been shared by the government today with the industry in a way that is actionable.
Or it's getting shared through Siobhan.
Well, that's
People-
exactly
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
One of the frustrations we have in the industry is that we're getting our news from the Wall Street Journal and not from the government. And even in our meetings with the government, they still do not talk about who the adversary is, even though the Wall Street Journal has reported for the last 6 months that it has been, in fact, Iran. So we have a lot of frustration with the government. In other respects, we have identified key infrastructure that has been used by the adversaries that is located in different parts of the world. We cannot necessarily affect that infrastructure because we have just been told by the FBI, quite frankly, that we will be prosecuted if we attempt to take it down. But when we ask the government to take action through Cyber Command or other measures, they refuse to do so.
Okay.
Dimitri, I've been through a lot of crises here, and this was the other point I was going to make. I'm sorry, Jay. And a number of observations, but this is the best one. Often the government can help, but usually it can help the most by doing the least, getting out of the way. And so what I'm hearing you do is come close to, but not go over a certain line. And if I can induce you to do this, entertain us, educate me, educate the group on what the government could do to get out of your way, to get out of industry's way. We do it all the time in other crises. We waive fuel regulations and driver time, sleep time regulations, and all kinds of things that are meant for peacetime, safety, and security. We're now entering into a crisis. This has escalated. What can the government do to get out of your way and let you engage in self-help?
Well, one thing it can do is not threaten me as a victim when I attempt to take care of the problem. That would be quite helpful.
Threaten you with what?
Criminal prosecutions.
Criminal prosecution.
Particularly, FBI and the Justice Department letting us know that if we take down infrastructure that is responsible for direct attack against us or against our clients, that we will not come under jurisdiction of CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and we will not get prosecuted. In fact, they've told us the opposite.
Are you taking down all these 80,000 innocent computers?
No. We're really talking about upstream attacker infrastructure, the command and control servers that they're using to coordinate the attacks, maybe some of their backend infrastructure that they use to plan and stage their exploits and malware that they're using. One of the other things we'd like to do is, in some cases, maybe not take them down, but gain access to their backends. We have identified just through public scanning a number of exploits that we can use and a number of vulnerabilities that is in that infrastructure that we can use to gain access and sort of listen in on that communication. But again, we face a problem of running into the Electronic Communications Privacy Act that requires either one or two-party consent depending on the state you're in. And of course, we're not going to get consent from the adversary to do that, and that becomes a big problem.
I think this is fascinating because civil liability is often the focus in our debate, but removing criminal liability or criminal sanction is, I think, a new and perhaps good idea.
I think you're seeing a split in private industry here, that there's a subset of industry in DC that advocates active response, but I think the rest of the private sector is not interested in committing crimes in response to crimes.
And so let's open it up. Siobhan?
Well, that's a particularly fascinating discussion because if that were to happen, that would certainly be a big news story, that the government was waiving the law to allow the private sector to attack on the behalf of its clients. But that is almost ceding a certain amount of otherwise government responsibility to the private sector. And it would be a very interesting environment under which the government decided that it was going to step back and actually allow private companies to take those kinds of actions because they have a lot of foreign policy implications. And it's also interesting to hear the deterrence discussion because so much of that right now and also in this scenario would be subject to the government's decision of, what is it that we want to deter and how can we do it? Because that has to be done through a public message. You can't deter secretly. Yeah. And so while the media in this circumstance is obviously going to be doing the basic things that we always do, trying to figure out, what happened, what are the consequences, who's responsible, we're also going to be talking with government sources who may be trying to send certain messages to the Iranians or to partners to the degree that they've had a chance to think through what kinds of messages to send.
Yeah, I think deterrence in this case is really difficult because what else can we do at Iran that hasn't already been done? I'm going to throw in something else here, but
Can I just
go ahead,
make one
and then I'm
clarification?
going to go to Greg and then Paul.
So just to clarify, the private sector, the security industry specifically, is not asking for permission or authority to counterattack the bad guy. What they're asking for is authorities to mitigate the damage, right? To stabilize the situation. If I see attacks coming from a server and I'm not able through voluntary means to get that server shut down because the owner of that server is either the bad guy or is an otherwise uncooperating victim, take the ability to shut down only the attack capability or gain ability to listen in so that I can defend myself better. So we're not asking to go vigilante and take down adversary
That would be a
networks.
better story, though.
That's an honest slap. But that headline, that's not what the headline is.
Right.
Even,
Not how it
even
plays.
if the journalists write the best article that balances this.
Well, that's because the journalist doesn't write the headline.
Exactly.
We
Right.
write very nuanced stories, and other
Greg,
people write
and
them.
then Paul, and then I'm going to throw in.
So we've had an interesting discussion about, when the private sector might start to engage the government and whether that's going to be a positive or a negative thing. So, there is a phase where the private sector leads, as Bill was describing, right? And I think there's even times when the government needs to step back, and you do not want the intelligence agencies and the Defense Department directly involved. I'm thinking about the Conficker worm situation in particular, where a lot of these computers may be in places like China and Russia, where the U.S. government being involved in a response, and particularly the intelligence agencies or the Defense Department being seen to try to orchestrate a response to a threat, may degrade the private sector's ability to reach across borders, which they don't have to the same degree, and orchestrate these networks. So I think this is starting to move into an area where it's attacking critical infrastructure institutions. There are public safety and national security concerns, and it gets more complicated. You probably have fidelity on the command and control infrastructure, like Dimitri is saying, and the question is, when do you want, first, can you identify that in a way and design options that don't hurt neutrals or innocents, right? I mean, this command and control infrastructure can be also servicing legitimate purposes, and to take it down has to be done in a way that doesn't cause, in a military sense, collateral damage, right? So I think the government is trying to figure out how much collateral damage might be undertaken by different sorts of actions, which could be in different authorities, law enforcement authorities, or defense authorities. And there's a vigorous discussion going on in
Proportionality.
at the White House between all the agencies regarding what can be done and how much collateral damage will be undertaken, will occur.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment with a hypothetical inject. And so I'd like you to hold on to that point about talking about collateral damage and authorities. But I did want to go to Paul because I know you've been trying to get in.
So I'm going to riff off the
Because
last two.
you're so shy.
if I
So,
may.
yep.
Yeah, that's right. The whole issue of private sector response, which is being talked about a lot. The Dutch East India Company used to carry cannon. The British East India Company used to carry cannon. The result of which is the British took over most of India and had to run the thing. So there is this issue: if your private sector gets involved in stuff, the governments are going to get pulled into it. There's no doubt about that. It's a gross analogy, but I'm trying to make the point. And I would put that in the context just that we've had in the recent Wicket conference in the ITU in Dubai, where there's a lot of, it's the G77 plus, whose view of that debate is partly that the Americans control the internet. And when they say that, they're thinking of Amazon, they're thinking of Google, they're thinking of, so to a degree for the private sector to act in this arena, you've got to think about the consequence that it could be seen as this is America Inc. From Keith Alexander through to Mark Zuckerberg, they're all one thing, and that they're right. And so I think that you need to keep that in mind very much. The second, then
Can I come into that? I think it's interesting because in this town, in Washington D.C., when we think about American cyber power, we think about Cyber Command,
That's right.
and we think about the National Security Agency. And when the rest of America and the rest of the world think about America cyber power as much as they do, they're thinking about this whole assemblage of the companies that are creating cyberspace and filling it with message. And that's one reason why I think we see this mismatch a lot, I think, within the Beltway, because we're thinking about cyber power in military terms, or government levers of power. So.
You know, Jay, the other thing that people don't realize is that the cybersecurity industry is not all located in the United States. So just in the last week, we actually had a security organization in Luxembourg that has initiated exactly what I just described. So we're not having a debate about whether the private sector should or should not act. The private sector is already acting. In this case, this private sector organization in Luxembourg hacked into servers located in Hong Kong that were used by the adversary and published an open report about how they did it, what exploits they used, and what they found as they were monitoring the adversaries on those servers. So you already have various companies, not necessarily U.S. companies, because in the U.S. you actually come under pretty strict jurisdiction and prosecution if you attempt this, but companies overseas, some in Europe, some in, based out of the Caribbean and other places, that are acting at will, and you're creating a situation where you don't necessarily have an equal playing field, because US-based companies are being asked by our clients, hey, I can go to this company in Luxembourg and get this great intelligence, why can't you do the same?
Okay, interesting. Paul, you had another point?
This whole series of master-servant relationships there, I think you've got to be careful about. I think the second one, to pick up what Bill was saying, was if we think about the botnets, or the sort of the main vector that's using to be attacked in this scenario, there are two parts of it, one of which is the amount of traffic being generated, and the second thing is the command and control. And the sorts of quite formal relationships amongst the ISPs to a degree deals with the traffic aspects. But when it comes to the botnets themselves, the command and control tends to develop a series of ad hoc groupings that often will emerge, semi-official, with a lot of very careful consideration about when government would be involved. The interesting thing for statecraft in this scenario is, let's say ConfigurBot is one of the botnets being used for the attack, is because it has an algorithm which changes its command and control so much, shifts it all around the world. The engagement of the private sector, the technical community, and importantly the country code operators in how to help respond to that would be very interesting, because one can imagine there'd be circumstances where, let's not use China, but let's use another country code, where they may feel it's in their national interest, or they may want to check whether actually they don't want to be associated with a command and control over something that's attacking the United States. And so there's an interesting blending that may occur in this scenario about the usual way in which this gets handled, which is basically amongst technical peers, as to whether, where is the influence of the state or the discussion of my national interest going to occur in that. Do I get engaged or not in trying to stop the command and control system? Yeah.
Well, I think the balance of risk mitigation, risk management is really important. I think that's something the private sector, particularly the banking industry, has a really good handle on. Credit card fraud. There's a vast amount of credit card fraud, and it's managed, right? There's a certain degree of it that is cost effective to deal with, and there's a certain degree of it that's cost effective to not deal with. And exactly the same thing is true of cyber attacks. There are a vast number of cyber attacks happen every second, right? The vast majority of them are not worth paying any attention to at all, right? So if you look at the relative scale of things, Cyber Command is minuscule compared to the American banking industry, right? The American banking industry, in turn, is not that big compared to how big Spamhaus was last week, right? So if you look at
the attacks against.
No, I'm just talking about amount of money involved and amount of bandwidth involved, right? And that's what matters to the private sector. Right. The attacks, so Spamhaus doesn't normally use very much bandwidth, right? Not very much at all. Tiny amount compared to, say, the banking industry. But last week, they needed a whole lot. To mitigate that, if you were just to go out and buy the bandwidth to do that, it's about $100 million a year. Spamhaus can't do that. The banking industry could, but would much rather not. To mitigate the effects of the attacks, the Tuesday, Thursday attacks against the banking industry, that would have been probably, say, $20 to $50 million a year, somewhere in there, right? Which, again, they'd rather not spend if they don't have to. By comparison, Cyber Command is a little customer of a little customer. And it doesn't really have influence in this space because they're not either subject to a lot of traffic or very much money.
And I think that's interesting with the numbers that you said. I mean, you said 20 to 50 million maybe to mitigate the distributed denial of service attacks just in bandwidth. That's not counting time cost. That's money that's spent largely because of the policy of the U.S. government that then is blowing back onto, and again, not to say the policies are at all wrong in trying to keep Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but it is interesting of the private sector having to shell out their own money. It's almost like a hidden tax. I sometimes think about if the attacks are going on them because of response to U.S. government.
It's waste and it's an arms race, right? We don't want to be wasting money and we don't want to be in an arms race.
Yeah. Brian?
That's why I argued before. It's really calls for a blended response. The financial sector is very wary of the offensive capabilities that it could undertake or could ask the government to undertake. In the scenario where we are now, we could be getting to a point where there are triggers for action. If critical infrastructure starts to suffer, if you cannot conduct business and the financial sector cannot operate, then you get into a situation where you do need some type of response. And where the financial sector is at the moment is trying to know what those triggers are and how they might be implemented to the extent that information can't be shared, which would be minimal, but at least knowing that there are triggers if certain thresholds are passed.
And that's going to be interesting. I'm going to hit one of those thresholds right now, but I'll be curious about what some of the other ones are. Now, I'm told that the Iranian government would do no such thing, but let me throw it out as a hypothetical so that we can see how it changes the decision making. So let's say that the new Iranian leadership goes in front of the UN General Assembly and lays out, look, here are all the attacks that have been happening against us. Poor us, poor Iran. We had Stuxnet. Our scientists are getting assassinated. We've had all of these things happen to us. It's clearly the West. And yes, we are the ones that are behind these attacks on the United States. They clearly take away the attribution as an issue. Already it was pretty obvious. In page 8, we've got the spectrum of state sponsorship. And it was pretty obvious that they were at least encouraging these attacks to happen. But they've gone right ahead and said, no, this is happening because we're directing it to happen. What does that change? And particularly, I want to look to Greg or Paul in how this is seen. So we've had thresholds, and Brian mentioned thresholds of disruption. But what if it's a threshold that the Iranian government says, yep, this is us?
Well, I think it makes it easier to recommend actions. And then the thought that I was having, because I actually thought that the scenario might evolve to more disruption, but you instead made it, focus on responsibility. At a certain point, the Defense Department, by its culture, is going to want to get proactive and recommend to the president that we get out ahead of this situation, right? There's the potential for them to escalate, and that will make it worse for Brian in the financial sector and make the environment messier. And sir, you have these options to stop that. And back to a point that Bill made earlier, one would be to sort of take it out of cyber and do something very dramatic and signal that if this goes further, the pain level will get higher, right? So use some sort of kinetic, attack, to signal.
Or at least a show of force.
Or show of force, yeah. Up an escalatory scale and say, you better stop. This has now crossed the threshold. This is going to become a conflict, a war, if you do not, right? There are things, you could also cross thresholds that we were getting at in terms of just taking out the disruptive cyber infrastructure, the command and control networks, worrying less about the collateral damage, because if you don't get preemptive and preventive now, your ability to stop it coming down the pike a month from now, especially since they've effectively escalated in a political way by being willing to say
Right.
we're doing this.
It's and we nicknamed this Iron Man attribution. There's no reason for Tony Stark to say I am Iron Man, but he wanted to do it for pride. And frankly, if a nation's trying to coerce another nation, at some point that nation might want to have to let the other country know that they're the ones behind it in order to get the change. So it'd be interesting to see through the conversation if this is now war. If this is how this is getting to. Before I go to Paul, I want to say I think we'll stay on this for about 5 minutes, and then I'd like to just sum up and let's talk about some of the options that we would have for the president, and we'll do that for a few more minutes. After that, Matt DeVoe is helping get our comments together on Twitter. So if you have any last comments, make sure to include hashtag Cyber912. Then Matt will come out. We'll get one question, and then we'll go to our panelists who have been nodding sagely throughout. So I'll be very curious on them. And so then we'll take break in 15 to 20 minutes. Great. Thank you very much, Paul.
I think this part of the scenario unleashes one of the great lurking legal issues. Because once this happens, either directly or I think in response to what would be inevitable internal political dialogues, opposition's asking governments questions, you'll have a large number of countries then asking their own people, are my networks being used by Iran to attack the United States? And if my airspace was being used by Iran to attack the United States, the law is really clear. And I think the law may be the same for electronics, but we've never really properly explored this because we've all got this myth that national jurisdiction applies to a packet-switched global network. But that gets really very interesting very quickly because then suddenly there's an issue of whose side are you taking? There's an issue of how do I find that out? There's an issue of a lot more attention to the command and control facilities and the tracking. There's an issue of am I now going to have deep packet inspection just turned on everywhere so I can look at this, find this and stop this? I think that would unleash not only a set of questions about where do you stand vis-a-vis the US, not only a set of questions where do you stand about cybersecurity, but a whole series of questions about where do you stand vis-a-vis the way this network works.
Paul, describe deep packet inspection and maybe dispel some of the myths about it.
Well,
but it's interesting. I mean, if it's
is it reading the email or is it looking at a packet of data? Can you explain what that means to the group?
well, it can mean just looking at the headers and what have you of traffic that's going through your ISPs. There are new standards coming out of Steering Group 23, which may even let you change what's going on inside the packet, which is really interesting stuff. But this is essentially tools that used to get only used by the spooks, have been introduced by ISPs to manage traffic, and now would be used by whom to look at, now you're looking at a whole new capability.
So data, video, emails, whatever, are broken into packets, and there's a protocol, and we understand this. So I think for the benefit of the group here, the idea here is that those packets have labeling on the outside, kind of an envelope, if you will, and the mailman can look at where it's addressed to and where the return address should return it if it's improperly marked. But then there's the content inside the envelope. So I'm getting at here with a packet of data. Each individual packet, until it's put together to form a message or a video or some content, is really a series of ones and zeros in code, right? And so I guess my question is, explain to the group what looking at individual packets is meant to do and not meant to do.
Well, I think that varies country by country. But I think I think at a minimum, people will be certainly looking at the envelopes and then looking at redirection or looking at ways of stopping. I think it would potentially, the consequence of this might be that it would put more force in the voices of those around the world who want the capacity not only to look at the outside of the envelope, but think it should be standard that I can look inside.
So you're looking in for malicious code.
I think where
And
you
the concern is abuse of that, is that right?
I think where you can draw a line is internet service providers globally tend not to do DPI, right? They look at the outside of the envelope and they use that information to do their jobs. Internet service providers that have a special relationship with an intelligence service tend to use DPI and look inside the envelope and make further determinations about what to do with the data based on what's inside the envelope instead of just the outside of the envelope.
This scenario is going to put more pressure on the taking attribution will put more pressure on the latter phenomenon.
Yep.
But I think it was interesting what you said about countries will start feeling more pressure to look at if they're involved in the attack because they're hosting some of the command and control in their own country.
Or they just transit.
But because I think that's interesting, because we could do that at earlier stages, right? Before it got this bad, I mean, say if we've got 1 million bot computer network that's involved in distributed denial of service attacks, and that's controlled by 10 or 100 computers, and if all 100 of those were in Luxembourg, or if 90% were in Russia, hopefully at that earlier stage, we're going with that information either through, that would probably have to be through State Department or Department of Justice.
But it sounds like the international community doesn't really care until Iran explicitly acknowledges the attribution. So on a technical level, nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is that they have
But we
come out and taken
we
credit.
could have forced this point.
To do it.
We could have forced this point earlier
Exactly.
if the government or others would have come out and said, here's the information on why
Yeah.
and why it's Iran. Here's the convincing case.
So they're only caring because we've made them care, not because Iran has attacked the United States, but the United States has now made it clear that we don't find that acceptable and we think they're harboring
Yeah.
or in some way looking the other way.
Yeah. I sometimes call this the cyber KAL moment, because when the Soviet Union shot down the Korean airliner KL-007, we wanted to keep it secret in the community, that we knew what the pilot knew. The pilot knew he was shooting down an airliner, and the U.S. signals intelligence community had that transcript and wanted to keep it to ourselves. And Reagan came out and said, no, we are definitely going to talk about that. We can't keep this. We have to show what the other side is doing. And Jeane Kirkpatrick at the UN had the transcripts so that everyone would hear those Soviet denials of we did not know and prove that no, the pilot knew. And so I think it'd be interesting at something like this if the United States or another government involved, or the next Estonia, will come out with more information. So.
It certainly shows the value of coming out from the government perspective with attribution and making the case that this is indeed another nation state that's doing that.
Yeah, and in this case, it's going to be some company that does a report that says, here it is, and here is all of our detail, as a number of cybersecurity companies has been doing.
But that doesn't carry the same
that
weight
would
as a
carry
government
not a total
report.
weight.
But I'm curious, how does this change? So we started in this looking at finance and denial of service attacks on the finance sector. Now, would this change, and you can either answer this, Brian, wearing having someone that's done this at Treasury, or someone that's now working with affected firms directly. How does that change the calculus of what's happening either in Treasury or in the companies themselves?
Well, it finally gets to the nub of the issue. And the attribution is out, the government has admitted it, and for those reasons, the ball is now in their court. That's a good thing. However, the downside, as Greg mentioned earlier, is that the financial sector will take more pounding as a result. So the interest in both Treasury and the financial sector side is to have as narrow a time frame as possible between that beginning and action being taken that is effective. Because otherwise they're dangling. And all that's happening is bleeding.
Yep.
So you have to triage this right away.
Yep. I'm going to go to Shaban, and then we're going to start taking our actually, we'll go ahead and then we'll do question from Shaban, and then let's frame our questions for the president and what we think, and then we'll go and get our first Twitter question.
Well, I was just going to say from the standpoint of where the story goes after Iran makes this announcement, I think that level of taking responsibility will take the story out of the cyber realm and make it mainly a US versus Iran. And it could be in the context of cyberspace is now the latest front in terms of this open kind of simmering coldish war between the US and Iran, but it makes it much more of a foreign policy and national security discussion. Certainly the story would also pay a lot of attention to what happens next to the banks or to other entities in the US and what sort of additional collateral damage comes from the fallout of this in the private sector and elsewhere. But that changes the dynamic of the story a lot.
And it changes a lot. I mean, if we are treating this now more as war, collateral damage is okay in war. It's okay if the people that aren't your intended target, even if they're civilians, get wounded, as long as it's proportional and other things.
But what if it's your own people?
Yeah, I know, because a lot of so much of the internet infrastructure is in the United States. A lot of that would be here. So hopefully we'd be using other elements to get at that. So to sum up, if in some sense we're kind of being the National Security Council or people that the president might call on, he might be calling on friends in the press or friends in the private sector, how do we sum up where things are right now? Are we at war with Iran right now? What kinds of steps should we be taking to mitigate this? We're meant to be in an extraordinary place, the worst cyber conflict we've ever seen to date. Are we asking the president for extraordinary things?
I don't think so. I don't believe we're at war until someone dies, and certainly no one has died, and to my understanding, no physical infrastructure has been impacted yet. We have had disruption. It certainly has risen to a significant level. It has cost us a lot of money, but lives are not at stake, and we need to be mindful of that. The president has a number of options in responding in an offensive capacity, whether it is in cyber or outside of cyber, in a kinetic space with show of force. But I think what's important right now is, from a recommendation standpoint, is to come out and publicly acknowledge that we're facing a threat from Iran and that we're putting them on notice that unless this activity ceases, there will be consequences. What those consequences would be, we do not have to spell out at this stage, and we can see how this plays out. But I think at a minimum, we need to make it very, very clear that this is unacceptable to us and that we will respond in kind.
And I'm really curious, Tom, you spent a lot of time one-on-one with the boss.
There's quite a bit of contextualizing going on right now. And so we're talking about Iran and its posture towards Syria, Iran and its posture towards its nuclear ambitions, Iran and its escalating conduct in cyberspace. And kind of what we're getting at here, not to overcomplicate things, I appreciate the reference to law, maybe an ambiguity there. But once we get to the point where we've decided we're at war, and there's kind of greatly settled international principles there, then the law of war is rather settled. I know cyber is a new wrinkle, but it's rather settled. And I give some credit to some of the work done by the Atlantic Council and the Talon Manual. But the question here is, have we poked the line enough to make him roar, or poked the line enough to make him bite you back or maul you? And so I think at this point, the president's not going to feel like he's been poked enough to maul the Iranians. He's just going to simply roar and threaten it. I think he's got a number of other important requirements, though. He needs to speak to the public. I would make a recommendation to him, among other things, that he seriously consider not giving third-party vigilantes, these other anonymous groups and others, the ability to come in and engage in so-called patriotic conduct. This was something you saw President Bush do after 9/11, was to admonish people to not go out and start taking justice into their own hands because they see somebody that they think looks Middle Eastern and can conclude that they have some culpability in the attack. That's it's not quite analogous, but we don't want anonymous groups and others going out and exacting a pound of flesh in this way, because I believe it undermines law and order. He might want to consider allowing the victims to more actively engage in defending themselves. And I don't think that does abdicate a government role, as Shaban maybe mentioned. I think we see that all the time. I think people are, if they're under attack or in imminent danger of property or life, or physical harm, they're allowed to take kind of extreme measures that we don't normally condone in legal circles. So I think
I'm sure he's taken a lot of calls from CEOs and others at this
There are CEOs demanding to speak to him. In fact, our challenge at this point is probably preventing that. Without context, what are you asking him? You're taking a lot of his time to simply yell at him.
Which CEO is yelling at the president?
Absolutely. People feel like maybe it goes the other way, but that's not the case. And I think most presidents will take those calls, but only to a certain extent, to the extent that it's useful. So we're contextualizing the threat. I think we're painting Iran as an increasingly irrational actor. The mullahs have clearly taken a stronger hold in our hypothetical situation where the election's gone the other way. And he's going to have to do this. And here's my final word. He's going to have to remember the computers and the internet and the protocols and systems are tools. And there are people using those tools, and if we want to change their behavior, we're going to have to change their behavior the way we always have before cyber, by threatening them or cajoling them or giving them some benefit. And I think that's going to apply to our allies as well.
Yep. Comments on this side?
I'll go on from the government perspective in that, both from the intelligence community, you're being asked some tough questions. I think one, which we haven't discussed much, is does Iran have do they have escalatory options? Could this get worse, both in cyberspace and or might they do things to close down the Straits of Hormuz and have an impact? Is this on a path, which gets to the second thing, which is what the heck are those leaders thinking about by making such a public, are they irrational? Can we not project what they might do next? Or do we have a sense, like in the current situation with Korea, maybe they're not ready to step over any line. There may be a lot of bluster. This is the top of the bluster, and therefore the national security risk is not what it might be if it goes up this escalatory ladder. So for me, as the intelligence community is trying to help the president understand his escalation, situation, and the Defense Department is trying to give him options, right? So if this could escalate, and there are preemptive things that we can do to achieve what's sometimes referred to as escalation dominance, either by punishing and making it clear it's time to stop this rhetoric in this situation, we're going to punish, or if we have things, and again, it's difficult to tell from the specifics here, can we take out their escalatory capability? Can we remove this command and control network so at least in cyber they're not going to be able to make the situation worse? But you're probably trying to give the president options that allow him to control the situation to a greater degree.
Right.
I think talking about war at this point is both premature and overly simplistic. I think the important thing, we know what Iran's point of view is at this point. They've said what it is. It is consistent with their actions, no real question there, and nothing really to be done about it directly. I think the important thing is to figure out who our allies are and who they aren't, right? That at this point, we have to figure out who's with us in shutting this down and who's going to help them in perpetuating it. Because Iran per se is not a major power, right? What matters is who lines up with them. And that we've got to figure out.
Great. And I was going to Paul, and then I think I'd like to take the first Twitter question.
So if I was sitting in a friendly embassy and I was talking to someone in the White House, I'd be saying, strong suggestion that somebody's tasked, maybe it's the head of the NSC or someone is tasked to understand that this is actually doctrine in the making. And we don't have any real doctrine at this moment, and so this is effectively forcing doctrine. And I'd be wanting someone to both capture that and think about it, but importantly communicate that very broadly with the allies as to exactly where it is. What's the thinking? This is what we're thinking at the moment. Here's the doctrine we're presently emerging. And potentially even think about at some stage whether this should be communicated more generally, because there's going to be copycats. There are going to be all sorts of people thinking, I can do the same thing now in my dispute between Territory A and Territory B. I'm going to do this, people are watching this. And so to a degree to which it can be communicated, this is the doctrine going forward, can stop there being some escalation process behind this into other arenas.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a number of cyber conflicts, but none that have gotten this far, and it's a great point that this will be precedent, and the decisions that the United States and like-minded nations choose will then be looked at the standard from then on. So I'm very curious about the questions that we've had from Twitter. So Matt DeVoe, do you want to lead us off with one question, and then we'll go to Joe Nye, and I'll try and alternate.
Great. We've had a lot of great questions, so it's hard to pick, but that plays kind of great into the closing comments. This is a question from @CarlGrindle. Do I think he's channeling his inner Bob Gorley? And I'm going to ask it directly of Greg. It says, with wake-up calls like Moonlight Maze, Buckshot Yankee, Titan Rain, etc., does a scenario like Cyber 912 provide any new strategic lessons learned?
That's an interesting question. I mean, because we're in the fray, right? So as Paul was just saying, make sure that you're thinking about the precedent-setting, nature of what's happening. This sort of situation would be providing all sorts of lessons, right? Mostly, interestingly, political lessons, right? Those situations sort of made clear to us that we should be concerned about the vulnerability of our infrastructure, because these things were possible, and some of those named incidents were the rise of espionage is, significantly entering into cyberspace. This discussion and we know DDoS attacks can be difficult. We know a lot about command and control. We actually know a lot more about attribution than we did back then. But this, as Jay was just driving at, we've now reached to a level where we're considering whether this is a conflict and war in which authorities and trying to gain escalation in a situation. Few of those situations involved another nation's nuclear ambitions. So now you've got this intersection between cyber and other, at least if probably not more important aspects in trying to learn the lessons of how to do cyber statecraft and diplomacy in a multi-factor sort of environment with cyber as a major new factor, I think that's where we'll be learning the lessons.
Yeah. Great. And then I turn to my right, Professor Knott.
This has been a very interesting discussion. Let me take up the phrase that comes at the end of the scenario. The press declares this the first cyber war, which of course Siobhan wouldn't do, but the rest of the press did.
Well, we would actually be reporting on other people.
Other
calling
people.
That's a serious point, though. I
Yeah,
mean, the
yeah.
press doesn't
Yeah.
make proclamations like that generally. Usually, you are taking cues from. In this case, it would probably be, U.S. government officials perhaps not speaking on the record, saying this is how we are discussing it now, and that would be the way that it would be.
But I think the important point that we got out of the panel is this is not the first cyber war. I mean, we've seen DDoS attacks often, and certainly accompanying political actions in Estonia or even violence in Georgia. This is not the first cyber war. I think the big danger is the question of talking too loosely about cyber war. I mean, we talk about any defacement or any attack as though it were war. And it's like war on poverty, war among the sexes. Very quickly, we don't know what we're talking about because we've used the word to refer to anything. So if we use the term war, it's worth noticing how we ought to use it. I think it ought to be reserved for a cyber war ought to be the equivalent of something which would happen in the kinetic world, which create enough damage that the president would make a political decision to respond with the massive use of force. But that then opens the question of, in kinetic war, it's really a political act. There's no sharp legal definition. For example, if you look at the situation in North Korea today, which is many people think is close to war. What's interesting is the North Koreans killed 46 South Korean sailors in the incident of the Cheonan, and nothing happened. And then they shelled an island and killed some more South Korean military, and nothing happened. So the question is, when does a president decide to declare that an act is war? And that's very much a political decision. In American doctrine, we say that we reserve the right to respond in cyber with any means we choose, which means that it will be like kinetic war. And imagine a situation where, leaving aside the cyber component, Iran shot down an American aircraft that was in international waters over the Gulf. We might or we might not respond by force. We might or might not respond with a warlike action, depending on what other objectives the president had. If you go back to the earlier scenario and we thought the Iranians are getting very close or had crossed the threshold of creating a nuclear weapon, this might be exactly the casus belli that the president wants. And that might lead to a declaration of war. And then you'd have your first, in quotes, cyber war, though it would be with a kinetic response. On the other hand, if Russia shot down an American aircraft over international waters, I doubt we would respond with force. Different deterrent values, also different questions of what the president wants to do for other reasons that are in the first part of the scenario. So we got to be very careful about this use of the word cyber war. War is a political act, political declaration, and there's not that much difference between cyber and kinetic in terms of whether you declare war or not. But that takes me back, and I'll say this quickly because I don't want to take too much time. The scenario to some extent was more interesting before the Iranians made their declaration. Because if you're a clever antagonist, you would want to use the ambiguity that goes with the difficulties of attribution. And essentially, that makes it more difficult for the president to make his political action. Again, to use the North Korean example, just to illustrate the problems that would go on in the cyber example, imagine that Kim Jong-un wants an exit ramp from this nuclear bluster that he's been on. but he doesn't want to back down. But a series of significant cyber attacks might be difficult for us to attribute. Are they, in Jay Healey's, state encouraged and state shaped, 3 or 4 on the scale, or are they 7 and 9, state ordered or state executed? We could eventually get the forensics to determine that, but it might take months. It took us 3 months to find out who sunk the Chernon, and even then we couldn't fully persuade the Chinese that the North Koreans had done it. So if you really wanted a clever strategy, I doubt you'd go to the UN and make that declaration. I think you'd stick in this area of ambiguity about attribution and make it a lot harder for the president to make his political decision.
Yeah.
In any case, the answer is be careful about throwing around the term cyber war. Not that much difference between cyber and kinetic war. And if you really want to look and tax the subtleties of what cyber brings to this political bargaining in a pre-war situation, then I think you'd want to keep the ambiguity and not make that statement.
And the reason we throw that in is sometimes the other side's leader is going to feel his own pressures. And a lot of times when you do cyber exercises, we always say we'll never know who the other side is because it makes so much sense that they wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that would be interesting would be in the bargaining and games that were going on before, if you really thought about the difficulties, you don't want to set up vigilantes or letters of marque, and Dmitry was very good about this. But there may be a situation where, in the ambiguity that the Iranian opponent would be playing, we would want to relax the legal restraints. In other words, we might want to say, all right, let NSA go after the controlling servers for this super botnet. And we would say this is a special situation. We have said we will respond with the means of our choice. We're not going to respond kinetically here. We are going to respond, however, with going after the controlling servers of this botnet, which we think, through early attribution, is indeed directed from Iran.
We would do that covertly or overtly?
You could do it either way.
And it is interesting because the government can only do that which it's authorized, at least in the West. Private sector can do all those things except those that are forbidden. So you do end up having this difference. So perhaps, Matt, the next question from Twitter, and then we'll go to Vicky. And I anticipate spending about another 10 minutes on this here.
So a question that I'll address to Paul from @HittingDingers, and he basically asked to clarify, at what point do the infrastructure providers consider it an attack on their infrastructure? Is there a certain threshold in the attack in which they say, hey, this isn't just an attack on this independent financial institution, it's an attack against our infrastructure as well?
Well, we've seen that on numerous occasions where the infrastructure providers become collateral to some other purpose. I mean, the most classic one recently has been Spam House, where that was really a bunch of people saying, I don't like you censoring my use of a set of servers, and I'm going to show that by pushing it all the way back. The response, though, from certainly the technical community, and it's a very specific term here, is about ensuring there's 100% uptime. So the response is not, I don't like you, you're a bad person, I'm now out to punish you. It is simply going to be, we need to do whatever we need to do to ensure everything is up. I should say, I think the sense of concern at the moment among some of the technical community about the challenges they may face is rising. That potentially what is engaged in trying to ensure that you can always do that response is, as Bill said a little while ago, I mean, it was different 18 months ago than it is now.
Well, I think one of the big differences between the internet and kinetic warfare is that in kinetic warfare, an arms race, is something that we've been through before. Militaries have a sense of what that means for their budgets, but ultimately the budgets are constrained by taxation ability and so forth, right? Yeah. In the internet, we're producing value, and the production of value brings with it new revenue and also reason for further growth. And that's not true of military. So we're doubling in size every 10 and a half months and have been for 30 years. So yes, we're not where we were 18 months ago. We're, order of 3.5 times that size, right? Which means that whatever attack seemed large today will be a small attack a year from now.
Yeah.
So I think the Spam House attack was interesting because although it was very large relative to Spam House, it was small relative to all the provider infrastructure. So that wasn't a big deal. But then they went after the London Internet Exchange,
the
and that
exchanges.
was
different.
made it personal.
But I think, sorry,
Okay.
I think one of these things to take away here with this idea of an arms race is this is jiu-jitsu. It's not like normal kinetic arms races. So the opponent is not having to have their money dedicated to building weapons. What they're doing is finding ways of using your own infrastructure against you. So it's actually your capital investment that is the basis of their attack mechanism.
The perfect asymmetric tool.
Okay, and I was going to try and make this transition on the London comment, but Vicky Woodbine.
Thank you.
Oh, and if you can make sure you speak into the microphone, please.
Of course. Thank you, panel. Very interesting debate. I think it's clear that there's a number of tensions at play here. There's the government role in balancing economic security and national security. There's the role of industry versus government. And then I think there's a key point on domestic policy versus foreign policy. And I'd just like to focus on the international aspects, if I may. I think in having this debate and coming up with these recommendations for the President, that tension between industry and government is key. There have been a couple of statements about the role of government is very much preventative or clean up afterwards. And I think that there's clearly more than that, and from that domestic focus and that foreign policy focus. So government would help set the tone of the debate. There would be diplomatic actions that we haven't quite touched on today. There would be a discussion on the merits of the public messaging and the naming and shaming, the role of information sharing. I think there hasn't, again, we haven't really touched on would actions predominantly focus on dealing with this as a static irritant and issue at the moment, or would government actions be focused on trying to halt Iranian nuclear ambitions? And I think that affects the debate on thresholds of actions and how aggressive those actions should be. Again, focus on what Joe said about what constitutes war and international law, how this would set a precedent for and have implications on international law. And then I think governments also have a role in de-escalating the crisis as much as possible and having a feel for how much this is. So on that, I think I'd just like to emphasize the point, obviously this all has an international flavor. All of those points that I've raised there should be debated in conjunction with international allies and partners. So on the back of that, I'd actually like to pose a question to the panel and say, in this scenario, and directed actually at government and industry, what might you be asking of international partners and close allies? Would it be diplomatic support? Would it be intelligence? Would it be helping coalescing a group of civil society advocates? And how would you balance those aspects?
I think you would certainly be asking for technical support because a lot of the attack infrastructure would be located overseas as well as inside the US. So you would most certainly be asking for both intelligence help on understanding that infrastructure and facilitating remediating it so that it's not involved as part of the attacks. So at a minimum, there's that aspect to it.
Yeah, I think kind of cyber and the internet, to Bill's point, is a collective problem in a sense. There are individual players, but it's being driven by the markets. It's not being driven by the government. And in that sense, the government has a problem because it tends to want to collectively address a problem from one centralized location. And that's not the case. The problem set here is decentralized. There are a number of users with a number of motivations and loss factors to consider. And so the government's trying to impose a centralized answer on a decentralized problem. And I think that's an inherent friction. And in fact, I think it's going to lead the government to have no choice but to focus on dealing with its allies in the sense of kind of population control, to make sure that we make clear that we won't tolerate certain crimes and certain things that disrupt society, but to stop short of going further into trying to essentially take over the internet and control governance and that type of thing.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting at the first day when we were into the scenario, you can imagine the United States saying, hey, countries, we need your help on this DDoS. Whereas when we get into the second part of it, it's no longer asking so politely. Its action must be taken on this, or else.
Are you with us or against us?
Yeah, I mean a much more muscular, and which I can see as being appropriate. So let's go to Matt, because we are cutting into break, and then Rob.
Great. So I asked this one of Tom, and this comes from American Liaison. And it builds on some of the earlier discussion. You know, if Dimitri's going to go to jail for hacking back, Anonymous doesn't have those same constraints. So how do we deal with independent actors that maybe for patriotic reasons or other reasons start injecting themselves into this scenario and taking action on their own?
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that premise. I think that Anonymous and any actor has those same constraints. Now, we have a difficulty in government due to constrained resources and capabilities in enforcing the law evenly and completely. But I think the law applies to an anonymous hacker as well as a corporate actor. The difference here is that Dimitri and his clients are asking permission first. They're saying what we think we're doing is defending ourselves, and it's not something that we're doing to hide from you. In fact, it's the corporate good citizen that is following the law, and it's the, I don't want to say anonymous, they might take issue with me saying they're not following the law. They feel quite emboldened by the righteousness of what they do, but I would say they are breaking the law in some cases. So. I don't know if that answers their question, but I think
would justice be going after them? I mean, would justice say, Anonymous, this isn't going to happen, make more than we are?
You know, it's interesting. How would the president effectuate such a waiver? Right now, I don't know if he has a mechanism at law. He'd be working with Congress. We haven't touched on that issue yet today, but Congress is a key player here. But what he might do is try to offer an assurance, this kind of unitary executive premise, where he tells the Attorney General and the FBI director, you will not prosecute these things, and if you don't like it, you can quit. I'm the ultimate unitary executive here, and all of executive power vests in me. And then he can make a similar assurance to the companies that are going to engage in this conduct. That's a very difficult thing for those companies to rely upon, because a new president will follow in a few years, and a new attorney general may come and go and quit and so forth. So I think we need a systemic answer to that. I'm intrigued by it, and I'd like to see whether Congress would give us the ability to not allow organizations to exact a pound of flesh, to exert some anger, to impose damage on the bad guy, but to stop the bleeding on their own side.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, Matt. And Rob, if you want to close this out.
What I found notable was that everybody on the panel thought that there was a lack of information flow, except for Siobhan. So I think that's probably a tribute to your reporting skills and journalistic skills. But there really was a lot of discussion about information sharing and about intelligence, and the lack of sharing and really inadequate sharing. So there are reasons, and the implied reasons, of course, are policy, they're cultural, but they're also legitimate reasons, and we really didn't touch much on that. And I'd like to comment on the fact that Paul had talked about Stuxnet, and you talked about quid pro quo. And so there's a legitimate example of where when information that should have been protected was not, was leaked, and then there's a potential for escalation because the adversary knew what our capabilities were then. They maybe suspected that we had done that. They weren't able yet to prove it, but then the information was shared. So the question I really have is for you, Siobhan, is that in the media, does the media feel a responsibility when you do receive information that is very sensitive information and could lead to an escalation? Do you feel a responsibility to protect that sensitive information? And if so, what's the threshold? How do you decide that?
Well, what we do in circumstances like this is collect as much information as we can. And it was funny that you pointed out that I wasn't expressing dissatisfaction. I think it's just, it's a matter of, we don't have the expectation that people will provide information. So everything you can collect is, you're doing your job, but that's a bonus. And so as you do put this information together, you may be collecting it from a variety of sources that are not sort of the official sources, but you will always bounce it against an official government press official at some point in the process before it becomes public. And that always gives the government the opportunity to raise objections, saying releasing it, oftentimes it's releasing it at this point will create a national security issue. And so then you can get into a debate of, well, how long do we hold on to it? Are you talking about hours? Are you talking about days? Are you talking about weeks? And Usually, if it is a significant request, holding back on a story for the purposes of protecting national security, these kinds of things will get escalated. So I will never make that decision. It will, I've seen circumstances where it is, a government official calling the head of the newspaper and having a conversation. And so in important circumstances like that, it's dealt with at very high levels. And usually you're weighing a number of factors. One, how grave is the national security risk of having this information become public? And two, is it likely to become public anyway? And what we often see are situations where maybe there's an agreement with the government to hold back on information, but ultimately that it gets published, and oftentimes I think more quickly than the government would anticipate, just because of the way information flows these days.
Great. Thank you very much. This concludes the first half. We will take about a 20-minute break, and we'll expect to see everyone back here at 1:15.